All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, so this morning I have the great opportunity to speak to Irmin Schmidt. That's not the German pronunciation, but it's as close as I'm going to get to it.
It's perfect.
Great, thank you. He has a fantastic background. He started off as a conductor. He went on to be one of the founding members of the band Can. Subsequent to working with Can, he did a ton of music, scoring music for film. And just recently, he's followed up his the 2018 release of Fünf Klavierstücke with a new release this May called Nocturne, live at Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. It's just a beautiful, beautiful album. Additionally, in 2018, he collaborated with Rob Young on a book called Can, All Gates Open, which is a very comprehensive history of Can. Now, in this interview, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Can. If for no other reason, it's really clear when you read the book that Irmin spent a lot of time really documenting the Can experience there. So I'm gonna point to that book as a place to go if you really want to learn more in depth about Can. We're going to be talking a lot about Irmin's background and his focus on creativity and how he approaches his work. So, with no more ado, let me introduce you to Irmin Schmidt. Hello, sir. How are you?
Hi. Thank you.
That was a very long-winded introduction. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Why don't we start off by having you tell us a little bit about this latest release, Nocturne?
Well, after the release of, after I made these 5 Klavierstücke, which means 5 piano pieces, which was, I hadn't done anything live since quite a while, except conducting film music, and I thought I should do what I for a long time didn't do, just experiment or just play again with prepared piano. The prepared piano is actually an invention of, more or less invention of Cage.
Right.
And John Cage, and I met him in the 60s, and being fascinated by his performances. And so I met him several times, and he introduced me into the techniques, how to prepare the piano for his pieces. And I performed a lot of Cage in the 60s. I conducted also with orchestra things like Atlas Eclipticalis. And so I started to think about making a record with prepared piano, basically also because with Gareth Jones, who produced the record, with him I did that. There was since 20 years the plan. He always said, let's make a piano record. And all of a sudden, having this idea of the prepared piano, I said, hey, listen, would you like to record in my studio this album? So that became quite a success, and it turned out to be a really nice album. So I thought that's an opportunity to perform live again, all alone, which actually all alone as a soloist, I didn't perform actually since Can. I didn't do that. From the moment on I was with Can, I never did some solo appearance, and afterwards neither. So that was a very exciting idea to go all alone again on stage.
That had to be a little nerve-wracking because you're out there all by yourself.
Well, I did that from my 12th year on.
I see.
Because at that time I had a wonderful voice, and I was singing. I was soloist sometimes. And then during studying piano, I did concerts and recitals. I mean, all the years until between 20 and 30. So, I mean, being on stage all alone was not nerve-wracking. Before, I'm always nervous, but
Right.
that doesn't mean, that doesn't make any difference if I'm alone or if I'm playing in an orchestra or in a group. Before a concert, I'm nervous. The moment I'm getting on stage, it's all gone. I feel at home and happy. I like stage. So I thought I should make a live performance art from these 5 piano pieces. But then it turned out that I had more ideas. And what I like very much is to sort of make a kind of duo with some pre-recorded soundscapes. And so for the Nocturne, actually I recorded these drops of water. And what I like is that it's so subtle, the different colors of a water drop into different containers or surfaces. Each drop has a slightly different color from before, and it has a similarity with these sounds you can make from this prepared piano, because they also every note, every tone sounds. If you play it a second time, it never sounds the same, because if you put a screw in between, or 2 screws between the chords, they move with every key. When you move the key, they slightly move a little bit, they move differently. And so the tone has a kind of strange vibration. And so I used that similarity of the drops, and these drops you can make on single notes of a prepared piano. And what I liked on 5 piano pieces is when you have both the normal piano sound and the prepared piano, there is a kind of, because it's never really tuned, a prepared sound. That has no definite tone. So between this, the real piano sound and the prepared, starts a kind of shining, which sort of makes the whole thing flaring and vibrating in a very wonderful way. And the more time you give that the single events, the more you can meditate into these vibrations, and that's what was fascinating me.
Yeah, you definitely play into that with these works, both on the 5 Klavierstücke pieces as well as this live performance. You give a lot of space around the individual note events, so that you can really experience when it's the prepared sounds or even a resonance of a nearby prepared sound. You really get to experience the whole envelope of the sound. It's really quite beautiful and engaging.
Yeah, that's what I'm after, to this kind of you really get into this. You can really meditate. You really get into the structure of every single sound, and you follow it and how it swangs and how it sounds. The longer you listen to it disappearing, you listen into the slight changes of color, and that's something wonderful and something very exciting.
Sure. One thing I'm curious about is so in the setup or in the preparation of the piano, first of all, there is clearly a definition between clear piano notes and prepared piano notes, but you're playing these both on the same instrument, right? It's just a single keyboard with only some of the keys being prepared.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Now, I've always wanted to ask this of someone who performed the prepared piano, and now I'm talking to someone, so I'm excited to ask this question. When you go to Huddersfield to prepare for this program, do you have like a map or some kind of, how do you have the information that says, here's the preparations I'm going to do for different keys so that it's a familiar playing surface for me? Or do you not worry about that?
No, it's not. It's quite different. Every time I prepare for a recording or a concert, a piano, it's like creating an instrument. I have no map. Every time I prepare the piano, and I prepare it very simply, not to create a lot of exciting effects. I prepared like 50 years ago for the cage pieces with some rubber pieces, with some screws, and not many different objects. And I have them with me. That's given, like the piano. But then where I put them depends on each time on the instrument, on the piano I get, how it sounds, how it speaks to me. And I put them never into the same chords.
Okay.
It's always slightly different. There are certain regions in high up and some of the deep ones, but basically it's in a way creating each time your instrument new, creating a new instrument. So that's why I cannot reproduce any of the recorded pieces in the way they are recorded, because each time the piano sounds quite different, the preparation, which means that I let myself being guided by what I hear when I play it. And it's more, it's not recreating existing pieces. It's just the experience of how this time this instrument sounds,
Right.
which this time I have differently prepared than the last time. So it's more the experience than of the moment than a kind of recreating
Right.
and a composition.
Yeah. So one of the things that, if we go back to the Can years, I always felt like your use of keyboards there was often either in a percussive role or in kind of like a cloudy role, right? And what's interesting is when when I listen to these pieces on the prepared piano, it seems like a lot of what you're doing is very percussive or very cloudy sounding. And I just think it's like one of those things that to me it's just like makes perfect sense. It's a perfect extension of your work.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, I feel like this. I mean, even if between Cannes and orchestral work and the opera and piano pieces, there are huge differences. But I feel always that I'm continuing doing something which is, so to say, my music.
Right.
And then no matter if it's with Cannes or like with the symphony orchestra or some mixing like in the opera, writing for singers and recording as a symphony orchestra and mixing it into electronics. It's using all the experiences, musical experience and traditions in which I was sort of educated and the experiences I had. And I'm continuing, and I feel that it's a consequent for me, continuing way. The breaks seem to be much more for other people between my work with Cannes and then or with the orchestra or with film or with piano solo. People think that's a huge rupture or rupture breaks between.
Right.
But for me, it's each time I'm using one of the many possibilities to express myself, but on a continuous kind of development.
Sure. One of the things that I like doing in my podcast is I like talking to people about their musical beginnings and how they got to be the artists they are and what were the things that were influential to them. In your case, some of that is recorded, but some of it is still kind of mysterious. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit, what was it like for you growing up? How did you first get involved in music? And how did that expand to become, to have you become the studied and sort of like complete musician that you ended up with? And particularly, what were the things that happened that opened your ears so that instead of like more traditional music, your ears were open to new music and to sort of the psychedelic music that was emerging in the 60s?
Well, as a kid, I grew up hearing a lot of music, just because both of my mother and my father played piano.
Okay.
And especially my mother sat down at the piano from time to time, just sat down in the middle of doing something, kitchen or whatever, and all of a sudden she sat down at the piano and started playing something, or sometimes accompanying herself and singing, because she had an extremely wonderful voice, and she was singing and playing piano to it. And that was just for me daily. That was so normal. I mean, from the first year on, as a kid, I always heard that. That was it was so self-understanding that from time to time you sit down and make music. There was nothing exceptional about it. And my father coming home from working or wherever on his travels, and just sat down on the piano and started playing. That was one thing. And sometimes there was the radio, and they listened to symphonic music. All that was just normal environment for me. That was one thing, and of course it always was classical music. When my mother sang, she was singing Puccini or Schubert lieder, and my father was sitting down and playing Brahms, and they listened to what came from this little radio in the in the 40s. So that was one thing. The other thing was that I was very much, as a kid, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, I was very much alone. I had 2 sisters, but they were so much younger, and I didn't play much with them. And I was very often alone, and I loved it, to be alone. And when I was alone, strangely, I sort of I wrote about it, and I talked about it quite a lot, but let's say it again. I had, for instance, this place in a nearby wood, in a kind of cave under a tree, and I was sitting there for hours, 5 years old, 6 years old, and listening to the sounds, and was absolutely happy. So environmental sounds really meant a lot to me. It was something where I could put myself and dream into it. The music was something, that was music. That was at home, and it was nothing I produced. But the sounds of, when I was alone, of environmental sounds were something which I sort of put to life by my own dreams and fantasies I put into them. And so that's why these soundscapes, I try to give them a name, let's say soundscapes, from childhood on, were an important part of my musical fantasy, my musical experience.
Sure.
And then later, when I started playing piano, rather late because of the difficulties there for piano after between and during the war, we were evacuated into the and in remote places. I didn't have a piano, but then my mother sang with me. She taught me lots of lieder and songs and even opera. And I sang all that, and then I had a wonderful voice, and I was singing in churches and things. And then the environmental became less and less important, and I concentrated really on classical music, and I started to play piano. And then when I was 18, 19, I think I was 20, when I heard to the first time Stockhausen's, I heard electronic and concrete music. Most of it I didn't like at all, and then all of a sudden I heard Stockhausen's Gesang der Jünglinge, the chant of the, I don't know how it's called in English.
That's what we call it in English too.
Yeah, and I heard this piece, Gesang der Jünglinge, and I got totally blown off, because all of a sudden it had also something really inside me, touched me deeply. And I thought that this electronic music, I can, with getting into that, I come near to my childhood experiences of environmental sounds, and I can create these things. So it grew from that moment, grew together the classical traditional education and the classical music with these electronic sounds, creating sounds electronically. And from that moment on, it sort of, I was into both. So it led me to studying finally with Stockhausen and with Ligeti, and Ligeti creating orchestral sounds which were so near to, they were like nature. They were totally different these like Lontano and Atmosphere.
Right.
The way he created the orchestral sound all of a sudden was like wind or like the sea or
a town in the distance. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so that was then the next step. And then the next was I got quite fascinated by fluxes and the crazy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But Cage was very near to fluxes. I mean, in a way, he was part of the fluxes movement too. It was the way to perform was totally different than this kind of sort of holy way classical music was presented,
Right.
When, I mean holy in brackets.
Sure.
At that time I performed quite crazy things, and I liked to perform Cage because, I mean, I also performed 433.
Right.
No, 20. I performed that in the middle of between Debussy and Boulez or Webern. And these were great moments, experiences. I mean, sitting down and doing nothing, and people getting nervous or getting thought I'm joking or I forgot my piece, even if on the program it was written what the piece is.
Mm-hmm.
But they thought, performing this is really an experience, especially if you perform it into a recital between different pieces.
Right.
Especially, I mean, like I did it once. I played Webern. After the Webern piece, I played this Cage, and it was really extremely strange. Some people stood up and went out, and one, and there was this woman which nearly exactly half the time made a long, really a scream. She just screamed.
Oh my goodness.
And that was spooky. And from that moment on, it was the public was quite nervous. There was a lot of noises. And then all of a sudden this woman, I don't know why, and I didn't meet her, I didn't see her afterwards, and she screamed, sort of, and after that, it was dead silence in the public.
Oh my.
Just total silence. There were people who were really excited of what, total silence doesn't exist. Then all of a sudden you hear every little rustle and sound, and that becomes great.
Yeah.
It grows into the silence. So, I mean, and that's something I could perform. So I mean, I like to perform it so much because it was part of my own childhood experience, listening into silence.
Right.
I mean, my mother tried to punish me, to lock me into my room and and shut the shutters, so it was even dark or nearly dark, and then I was sitting there and was totally happy.
Right.
Started singing or doing nothing, just sitting there and listening of the sounds, distant sounds in the house. And when she got me out, I say it was great.
That's hilarious. It's interesting though. I actually really understand what you're saying. I too grew up in a very alone situation, and there's something about that that trains you to sort of like draw things out, right? You can, through your concentration, draw things into your awareness and stuff. And I think that's maybe what makes that cage piece so uncomfortable for people, is many people haven't had that experience of having to focus or being forced to focus on these minute things, and it's very uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, it's definitely like this. And so back to the piano pieces, they use this listening into silence, or I mean, into these sounds disappearing, and the very subtle little vibrations between two sounds on this prepared piano. So that's it has. I also studied during my studies ethnology, music ethnology, and especially old Japanese gagaku music. So I found in Japanese spirituality, in their thinking, in their way of creating, a very similar thing. It's not because Cage also was into it. I came from a different angle, but I found the same thing in it, of meditating and getting into something very, very deeply, into a sound, into the vibration of one single string.
Sure.
And listen to it disappearing. And that's something in Japanese music. And then there is this violence in it, a very special one. You're listening to it, and all of a sudden, bang!
Right. Another thing, that use of dynamics is something that you really highlight, though, in these solo pieces. I mean, that's one of the things that actually, for me, I had a very interesting experience listening to the Five Klavierstücke album in my living room through speakers. So much of our listening now takes place with headphones or in a car or something, but I was doing it in the living room, and it really highlighted the dynamics, because it's bigger speakers, and the dynamics and the range and the way things would pop up and be very theatrical, I thought was one of the things that really made those pieces stand out.
Yeah, it's very important. These dynamics. It's like, when you read Japanese or Chinese as well, these kind of meditation, education, or Tibetan, it always has this thing that somebody, the teacher, comes about and just gives you a real a hit from behind on your head. Bang!
Yes.
It's just that, meditating is one thing, but sometimes you can easily fall asleep.
Right.
And just, and that's what dynamics are for. They sort of keep you alert.
Yeah, they keep you engaged with it, right? Now, one of the things I'm curious about is, and I really enjoy your film music. I would say that after the 5 piano pieces, it's your film music anthology that I listen to the most, and I find that work beautiful. One, because, it definitely also has sort of a dramatic and kind of theatrical sound to it. You hear them and they make sense within the context of films, but also it's something that you've done that is highly, highly melodic. And, again, going back to your work in Cannes, there weren't a lot of options for you to be pushing the melodic angle of things. And that wasn't kind of the shtick of what you all were doing in that group. So this seems like kind of a specific outgrowth or or a new perspective, or maybe it was a return to things that you were doing prior to Cannes. I'm not sure. But for you, what is the inspiration for doing the kind of work that comes out in your film music?
Well, basically, of course, it's always the film I'm working for, which gives me the idea to make what I'm doing for this film. I mean, it's the film which inspires me to invent a melody or a certain sound world. And making music for films is of course a quite different thing, because you can't. I mean, you are part of a bigger thing. You cannot just make a wild noise where it doesn't fit.
Right.
So you have to fit into a whole thing of which you are part of. Which doesn't mean that the music then can be a thing, or at least parts of the music can exist on their own right. And do so, because I never release film music the music of whole films. I only put out on record then. That's why I do this anthologies. I put out only the pieces which can stand on their own,
right,
and are not illustrating sometimes or just accompanying something. And the basic inspiration, of course, is the film. I don't know. Maybe because my mother wanted to be an opera singer and couldn't be. I have a sense for the dramatic arts.
I see.
And because I heard so many opera arias from my mother, and from her, how beautiful. Well, and she introduced me to go into opera. After the war, it was relatively late. She would have sent me with 10 to the opera, but it wasn't possible. So I love opera, and film has quite a relation. I mean, it's like being born out of opera film, because when you imagine in the late 19th century, opera was something you went to, like then later in the 20th century you went to the movies. Film has all film has actually sort of a feeling like more than opera than theater. It's really it has this operatic grandness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very attracted. I love Wagner, and I love these big operas which last hours. And of course, when you think about opera, you think about melody, because you have singers, and singers sing, and when they sing melodies. They might be strange and crazy, or they might be simple, but it's melody. And that's why when I'm doing film, maybe I'm nearer to melody than when I'm doing others. That may be an explanation.
Right. Well, you went on to do actually an opera. The name of it was, help me with this,
Gormenghast.
Gormenghast. Okay.
Yeah.
Was that because of like this connection with your mother's love of opera and this early thing? Is that just something that you really wanted to do?
No, actually not. Actually, I really liked to go to and listen to opera and seeing it, but listening to it. Mm-hmm. And I went a lot until I had finished my studies and started to work in an opera house. As first you started as a co-repetitor. I don't know if how you call it. You sit on the piano and teach the singers their role, their part. That's how you start, and from time to time you might conduct the choir or something like this, So after having worked in an opera house, I was fed up with opera.
That'll do it, huh?
I went to see opera, but I didn't want to so much to conduct operas.
Right.
So I was much more then into the symphonic literature and performing new music, especially contemporary music. And then after Cannes, when I was already living part-wise in the south of France, one day I went to a healer, a woman, a wonderful woman, and I didn't go because of me. I went because of my sister was ill, and somebody said, go with her to this healer. She's fantastic. She couldn't help my sister because she was very honest. She said, that's beyond my possibilities. You have something like, it's very complicated. Actually, you should be with me every 3 days for years, and maybe I can make it less painful, but I can't really heal that. And I was very impressed of her. So I visited her from time to time, just when it was on the way where I bought my wine and to the vineyard and the domain, and I passed her house and I said hello, and sometimes when I had a hangover, and I had headaches, she put her hands on my head and it was gone. And also I was suffering from my knee, which later then now I have a prothèse. So she put her hands on, and for some days the pain was gone. And one day she put her hands on my head and said, oh, you want to write an opera? And I said, no. I said, no, never. I'm done with opera. I go and listen to it, but I won't write it. And it's much too much work. It's much
right.
And she said, well, that will be stupid. It will be one of your greatest works. So I went home and forgot it. But it sort of started working in my head. And then I thought, well, maybe I do an opera for film. Only a film in which all the characters sing.
Right.
And I invented a story which made it totally logical that the people which normally talk more and more were singing. It leads too far to tell you the story. But then I needed a lot of children in this because it were the children which sort of incited the singing. So I thought, well, making a film with children is very complicated, and
right.
It's because you have to all these laws with when they are allowed to work and whatever. So because I worked so much for film, I know all this bullshit, and so I gave it up. And then some years before, Duncan Fallowell, a friend, a writer, had introduced me into these Gormenghast books by Mervyn Peake, these fantasy books. That was because everybody was excited about Tolkien, And besides the fact that it's very entertaining books talking, but it has quite a, well, I wouldn't say fascistic, but near proto-fascism into it.
Right.
And I don't like Tolkien, but there is a hidden kind of racism in, and Duncan said, well, read Mervyn Peake. That's real fantasy of its great literature, and it's totally crazy, and it's wonderful. So I read that and I loved it, put it into the shelf of my bibliothèque. And at the time when the first time when we lived we made the house here in the south of France, there was all the books around the bed, and we lived in sort of in my bibliothèque. We slept in the bin, and now it's my studio. At that time, there were all the books around. I woke up one day, and I saw in the shelf up there Gormenghast, and all of a sudden, it was like lightning. This is actually an opera. Gormenghast, this story is an opera. And then I found out, I sort of reread it and learned more about the biography of the writer of Mervyn Peake. And I found out that Mervyn Peake himself wanted to turn it into an opera and had even asked Benjamin Britten to turn it into an opera. And Britten didn't want it because it seemed too complicated as a material for an opera. And also, obviously, it was quite complicated to work with Mervyn Peake because he was quite a character.
Okay.
So, and later he became very ill and sort of didn't recognize his wife anymore. And, it was a very sad story. But this book is an absolutely incredible. So I read it again and started getting this idea to turn it into an opera, not a book, because it's much. You can actually, if you turn that into an opera, it's a 36 hours serial.
Oh my goodness! Okay, got it.
if you tell the whole story,
Right.
And so I made a kind of scenario of a skeleton of what I think I use of the book, and what I tell. But the characters are the characters of the book. And then I asked Duncan, who introduced me and who was a writer, to write the libretto, which he, after it lasted a while, because he was working on something else and was quite reluctant in the beginning, as I was reluctant to write an opera. And so finally he wrote it, and I think it's one of his finest literary work he ever did. So I wrote the opera.
That's an amazing story, and it explains a lot that I didn't really know, because it seemed like an extraordinary task to take on, but it also I was wondering why you had chosen that particular work, and that actually is really a beautiful story.
One of my very important part of my character is perseverance. Once so, for writing a 3 hours opera, you need perseverance.
Right, certainly.
And to undergo 10 years needs perseverance to tell you.
But in a way, that's kind of those are two different works. One of the things I got out of reading the book, and I want to tell you, I want to thank you for working with Rob Young on putting this book out, because it was really, it was the kind of depth that I think the band needed. And the discussions with you and the interviews that were published were pretty fantastic. But one of the things that I got out of that is that there was a certain extent to which creativity in Can was also spurred forward by the fact that you guys kind of fought a lot, or at least had like creative disagreements, right?
Yes, very much so.
But then when you go on to do solo work or writing an opera or doing the piano pieces or even film work, you're working alone, which, unless you're schizophrenic, you're not really fighting with yourself very often. What do you do to sort of like spur yourself into new territory or into creative territory? Like Cage oftentimes did things that were kind of game-based, right? Or Stockhausen did a lot of stuff where he constructed these structures that kind of forced him in a direction. I mean, these are kind of gross simplifications, but what do you do to sort of like force yourself into new territory?
I wouldn't say I force myself. It's rather the opposite. I sort of fall into new adventures. It's like, I don't know, it forces me maybe, but forcing is
it's a violent word, yeah.
Violent image for it. It drives me, maybe, I don't like routine. I mean, I hate it. I don't like to repeat things. Even if they are successful, I'm getting bored if it's not, inventive. If it's not something which surprises me. In a way, I want to be surprised by the possibilities, of my own brain. My own brain can. I think everybody's brain can produce a lot of creativity if you just let yourself really drive into it and guide it, and if you are open to it. But then you have to catch the moment, and that needs discipline. So it's both. It's the sense for adventure. It's just like automatic writing, like it just follow your fantasy.
Right.
But then when you catch a moment, it's like this. You see this book up in the shelf of Mervyn Peake, this Gormenghast book, and your brain was working on the idea and having ideas about opera, and then all of a sudden it makes bang. And you see, this is the moment. And then it needs bloody discipline to do it, and perseverance to get the thing done.
That is a great point and a great story. Unfortunately, our time is up. But before we go, I'm wondering what are you working on next now that the release of Nocturne is complete? What's next on your docket? I think your fans would love to know what you're working on for your next work.
There is one very boring work I have to do. I did already, and it's also quite exciting, but. Actually, Spoon Records and Mute, we will release a series of Can Live records.
Okay.
And I had, like I did already with when we did Lost Tapes, going through our own archive. Now I'm going through the archive of a fan who collected hundreds of tapes and amateur recordings of live concerts, because we don't have good live. We didn't have, and only very few are on records.
Okay.
And finally, I was talked into it to do it, and I went, and I will further go through hours and hours of recordings of concerts, and I found already 3 good sets. I don't want to look for one piece of 8 minutes and then another piece from another concert.
Yeah.
And that's boring. That sort of highlights the best of. What I'm looking for is whole sets of at least, say, an hour.
Sure.
And of the dramaturgy of the architecture, because we invented the music we played on stage. Uh-huh. And we never knew when we went on stage what we will play. And even if we quoted pieces which we had recorded, they became something totally different every time on stage.
Sure. Yeah.
And so what I'm interested to find is how we developed if we did a set of 1.5 hours and then a pause and then another set of an hour. If at least one set of these concerts as a whole, even if there are parts which get boring because or get down and then it gets up and then all of a sudden this is what it's really life about. And I'm looking for that. And of course it's interesting, but on the other hand, it's past. And
right.
And listening to your own past is nearly as boring as talk about your own past.
Okay. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion. It was really great to dive into depth on this. I learned an awful lot, and I really do appreciate your time.
Thank you. That was a nice talk.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Well, I'm so honored to have been able to spend the time that I did with Irmin. It was really amazing. If you want to hear an interesting little side story about a little piece of hardware that he had developed called the Alpha 77, we have an extra little bit of an interview on the Patreon for $5 subscribers. Feel free to jump over there if you want to join up. That would really be appreciated. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop me a line, darwin.gross@gmail.com, ddg@cycling74.com, or ddg@20objects.com will all get hold of me. In the meantime, I want to thank all the patrons for their help. I want to thank people like the folks over at Synthopia and CDM for their continued support. Thank you so much for continuing to listen, and we will catch you next time around. Bye.